I'm Tony Ruiz, contributing editor at Gold Derby, here with Nick Chuba and Leopold Ross, who are two of the composers behind FX's new adaptation of Shōgun. And either one of you can take this first. When you have a project like Shōgun, which is this big, sprawling epic that is also a period piece, that is also a property that is so well known, what's the first kind of thing that comes into either one of your minds in terms of the scope of what it is you're going to be tackling?
I think you try not to think about it as a giant, huge undertaking that you're throwing yourself into, and just sort of start kind of small and thinking about the characters and their inner psychology and their motivations, and what this sort of like emotional tapestry of that could be, how that could be reflected in the music, and just prioritizing, I guess, the story and the core emotions behind it, rather than just we're taking on a giant project and it's got to be huge and grand and all this, and then eventually getting to that. But I think that's sort of just trying to stay grounded, I think. I don't know, Leo, how you felt.
Yeah, but... no, I think that's right. I mean, normally we have, normally we put in a lot of work before we've seen any images or anything like that. It's more based on like having conversations with the showrunner and reading the scripts, and kind of like a lot of it's based on sort of excitement and inspiration initially, and just sort of like running on that adrenaline of being excited to be involved in the project, whatever it is, you know what I mean? And then you sort of like, for me, it's sort of like let my subconscious blast out some stuff, and then we can go back and look through it and see what it actually means, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And something that I just kind of, that strikes me about just listening to the music of this show, it's both grand, but it's also like surprisingly intimate. It balances this scope and this scale with a true sense of intimacy. Was that sort of a conscious decision on your guys' parts?
I think that it came out gradually. I mean, I was re-listening recently, and I was surprised by how much sort of ambient music we had made for a show where that's maybe not the first thing I would think of. And I think a lot of that comes out when we first got brought on. We were reading the scripts, and so much of it is about the inner, like, it's like a lot of rumination about death and honor and all these different things that is driving all the characters. And I think bringing that out through more, like you say, intimate music made a lot more sense to us. And I think that sort of aspect of the show is what led us down that path. So yeah, I think it was mostly about thinking about their inner psychology was the big reason why we were writing music like that, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think that what Nick says is very true. And I also think that there is this kind of underlying theme within the show of poetry. And so I think the kind of delicate ambient stuff sort of goes along with that thread of the show.
Yeah, and I think so much of it is in the instrumentation, because just there's a sonic quality to so much of the music here that is so hard to place, and yet feels so perfect for the time. Yet, how do you even begin to think about instrumentation for a story that takes place in the 1600s? What kind of research did you do to kind of create this sound?
We did a lot of research on the traditional music of that era of Japan, which is like the traditional court music of Japan in that era was something called Gagaku music, which is a very specific style of music played by a very specific set of instruments. So after we kind of delved around and listened to both period music and contemporary music that uses those instruments, we kind of did some research and found the guy who became our arranger, whose name is Taro Ishida, who was an arranger and also a musician manager based in Tokyo. And he was really key to kind of opening up the world of those period instruments for us to be able to have access to those players. But at the same time, our goal was never to make period Japanese music. The goal was to make something that was singular to the world that Justin and Rachel had created, you know, this kind of exquisitely detailed, rich, epic world. And we felt that we wanted to bring in the Gagaku instruments into a little bit into our aesthetic as artists.
Yeah, in terms of the research and sort of like the one thing that was really drew us to it in a way was that the actual shogunate the show is based on a real man named Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was a shogun who was brought in this huge era of peace in Japan, and his shogunate, the Tokugawa shogunate, actually repopularized the Gagaku tradition of music, which had sort of fallen out of fashion by the time the events of this show take place. So there was an additional tie-in, like, you know, of this music sort of being around Toranaga, whose family line would eventually make this music popular again. And I think doing that sort of, I think what inspired us to look that deeply into, you know, the era and the music of the time was just how, when we first saw the footage of come in from the show and the level of like detail that was in the costumes and the sets, and like, you know, I don't know if you noticed, but Mariko has like her poem about the leafless branch, and all her clothes have these like branches that don't have leaves on them. And like in the first episode, she goes back to her quarters and her walls are all these like leafless trees. And so I think just seeing that level of attention that every department's putting in to the show really made us try and look equally as deeply at what the music how it could tie into the characters on all these different levels.
Did that level of detail also apply to the actual recording of the score?
I mean, we used our idea was to sort of like not have it sound just like traditional Japanese music and not just like electronic music, but the way we sort of approached it was using like they have these very specific phrasing and phrases that they use in their vocabulary in Gagaku music, which we learned about through Taro Ishida, our arranger. And we would record some of these phrases, but then take them, put them in the computer, manipulate them, and turn them into something else entirely. But at the core of it, it is based on these like original phrases that are in their vocabulary. So I think in a sense, our like color palette is taken from that sort of traditional phrasing, but then we sort of make new sounds with that material, if that makes sense.
And we would then also take what we had made from their material and have them play over the top of that, and then take it back into our lane and reprocess it as well. So it was definitely a lot of layering and layering upon layering to get the sort of specific sound.
I talked to a composer yesterday about how technology has kind of, you know, opened up new dimensions for how scores are created. And so I'm curious as to, you know, as to how technology factors into your guys' process.
I mean, it factors in the sense that every possible sound you could think of making is at your fingertips. So I think a lot of the time for us, it's about being reductive and setting some parameters, and that's something that we had initially at the beginning of this process. We had the idea of recording the Gagaku instruments, and then building our own sounds from those instruments, and sort of sticking within that sound and within those limitations allowed us to kind of be creative within the palette that we had, and therefore create something unique. I think, too many, there's such a thing as option paralysis. You know what I mean? And you don't want that.
Well, I'm curious, as composers and between all three of you, Nick and Leo and Atticus, I'm curious as how you all three worked together on this. Are you working separately and bringing things together, or are you all kind of collaborating at the same time?
Normally what we do is we have a sort of conceptual idea conversation at the beginning, which is sort of similar as what I was saying in the last question. It's sort of like we had a concept of how we wanted to approach the music. Then we would sort of go away and each sketch out little ideas, which we would sort of share amongst each other. And from that moment, all of those ideas get split into what's called stems, which is, all the different tracks. And from that point, it's kind of a free-for-all. Like, I could take something that Nick did, he could take something that I did or Atticus did, and we can, sort of meld that into something completely different and then put it back in the pot, and someone else can take it and meld it in a different way. So it sort of becomes, I don't know what's a good metaphor for it, but like there's a lot of different mutations come out of, what might have been a small selection of ideas at the beginning. And there's also times when we're all in the room together working on a specific scene. It kind of depends on what part of the process it is. Initially it might be that thing of, hey, let's all sketch out some ideas. Then as we get into the show and it becomes apparent what are evolving into the themes of the show, then we'll sort of drill down on those things together, and we might have gone and recorded some specific themes with Taro in Tokyo. Not us being in Tokyo, it was all done over Zoom, but I guess it's dependent on what part of the process it is. There's times when we're working alone and there's times when we're working together.
Is there a challenge? This show has so many different layers to it. It is in many ways, such a grand show. And again, as I said earlier, is such an intimate show. Is one of those scales easier than the other? Like, is it easier to write something for a quieter moment, or is it easier to write something for a big grand moment? I mean, or do you see them as just different sides of the same challenge?
I would agree it's different sides of the same challenge. And I think a lot of it is dependent on how the showrunner or director has executed the scene. It's hard to make something epic that doesn't look epic. But I feel as though with Shōgun, we were very lucky in that it looks mind-blowingly epic. Therefore, it makes our job slightly easier.
I'm a sucker for title sequences. I'm a sucker for those opening title sequences. I never skip the intro when it gives me the option to, because I just love that it sets up so much of the show. So can you talk a little bit about how you guys came up with the sound of that opening title sequence? Because it's just breathtaking.
That one, it took a while. We were still working on that. when episode 10 was, we were working on episode 10 and we were still working on the main title sequence. It started with that initial batch when we send stuff before they start shooting, and we had sent this batch of music to Justin, and that was one that really stood out to him, the original version of that piece of music. Then he said that's going to be the title sequence. And once we actually started getting the title sequence visuals, we needed to, change it to match in a lot of ways. And by that point, we had also found all these musicians and discovered this Gagaku music. And so we first tried to incorporate the Gagaku stuff, and then we needed to basically go from this serene, tranquil Zen garden to this like time of war and the garden's disturbed. And getting to that level of intensity, I think, took us a while. Where it reaches like, it goes to like a 14 or whatever by the end of it. So, I think it was a long process, and it took a while, but we got there, and it was, I think we're proud of the result for sure.
Yeah, it was one of those things that initial idea did lean more ambient. I would have put it in the more ambient category. And I think that's kind of what Justin loved about it in some ways. But then obviously, there's almost a format of how title sequences need to unfold. Like it needs to always be growing, to the climax. And so that there was a lot of work involved. I feel as though something that clicked for us, and kind of pulled it all together was the Buddhist monks. We were lucky enough to record some Buddhist monks in their temple in Chiba Prefecture. And this really only came about because Taro Ishida, our arranger, mentioned to us, hey, there's these Buddhist monks that are doing a festival at their temple. Like, if you want, I could go up there and record it. And we said, definitely, yes, do that. Because these aren't musicians. Like, you can't hire these guys to do a session. It's more like capturing them in their own environment. So we got some recordings of them doing a technique which is called shomyo, which is where they're all kind of layering on top of each other a specific chant. And something about the way that comes in the main title, I feel as though helped bridge from the ambient into the more sort of intense outro.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how do you, because I'm so fascinated by the way musicians can come up with music, and it's a skill that I envy so much. And I'm curious, how do you know when you've gotten it right? Is there just like a feeling that you get? How do you know when I got it?
I don't know. I've never felt that. Still waiting for that to come.
I mean, I will say I kind of agree with Nick. I don't know that I've ever really felt that, but I mean, this might sound like a little bit of a hippie-ish thing to say, but in my experience, the great stuff just kind of happens, and you can't really explain how you did it or why it came to be. You just kind of like, it just sort of happens. Whereas, sometimes when you have to really slog away at it and force it, it's maybe not so great. I don't know.
Yeah. Also, it's funny because like sometimes you get you're working on something and they'll use temporary music, and they'll use one of your pieces that was from something else, and then you're supposed to sort of redo it, and you'll spend almost more time on that recreation, and it's like half as good, and it's like I have no idea why that is, but
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big advocate for not thinking. And I think that if you can get lost and kind of let your subconscious take over, then maybe that's a way to get to something interesting.
Well, gentlemen, congratulations. I mean, it is, in my opinion, just one of the great achievements of the year on all levels, and the music has so much to do with it. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the upcoming award season, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders in the coming weeks. Nick Chuba, Leopold Ross from Shōgun. Congratulations, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.